Hello everybody and welcome on in. Today we're going to do a straightforward video taking a look at the Greatsword, the different skills that it has, taking a look at the passives, and of course talking about how good or bad this weapon is going to be, especially in PvP, as I am a PvP player myself. Keep in mind the Greatsword is not on the live server or the PTR yet, so we could see some changes to these skills in the future. I've got a link down below to the full Greatsword trees if you guys want to check out a written version of it. So, starting off, the Greatsword is actually a strength primarily and secondarily dexterity weapon, which means you can pair it with a lot of different weapons in the game. The first big thing about Greatsword is that they have two different stances based on which abilities from which tree you're using. You have the Path of Onslaught and the Path of Defiance. Using an ability from each respective Onslaught or Defiance tree will put you into the Onslaught or Defiance stance for 10 seconds, and then using an ability from the other tree or switching to your other weapon will cause you to exit this stance. Also, it seems that you don't have to put any points into the Greatsword in order to get these stances. This is just something that's going to be automatically built into the weapon. So each stance is either going to increase your damage done and taken by 20% or decrease the damage done and taken by 20%. The real interesting part of these stances for me is the Quick Charge and Guard Point abilities that they provide. Quick Charge from Onslaught will make your heavy attacks twice as fast but consume 10 stamina each, while Guard Point will make it so that you block incoming attacks while charging heavy attacks. The big takeaway that I have from this is that the heavy attacks for Greatsword, whether you're in Onslaught or Defiance stance, are going to be pretty stamina intensive. So stamina sustain on the Greatsword is definitely something that I'll keep my eye on. So the first active skill in the Onslaught tree is Relentless Rush. It pushes you forward a pretty decent distance, and it looks like it deals a pretty decent amount of damage, giving you that Empower as well. And then you're given a choice for the final passive of this skill. Either Adaptive Rush, which will apply Root when you're in Onslaught stance, and heal you for 15% of the damage done if you're in Defiance stance. Or you can go for the Relentless Refresh, which will reduce the ability cooldown by 50% when you kill a foe. I think this will be a strong offensive skill that also offers some defensive utility, as it's the only mobility-based skill that Greatsword has. The next skill we have is Crosscut. This is going to be 3 rapid slashes in succession and looks to be one of the better DPS skills that Greatsword has, dealing quite a lot of damage, especially on the final hit. You have Grit while performing this ability, and if you're in Defiance stance, you will gain stun immunity, which is a pretty big deal defensively. And the final hit of this ability will deal increased damage if your opponent's below 50% health, or below 75% health if you're in Onslaught stance already. A very straightforward and powerful attack that has kind of a longer cooldown for this sort of just an offensive spammable. I'm also curious to see how good the tracking on it will be for PvP. The next skill we have in the Onslaught tree is Skyward Slash. This is a 2-hit attack in which the first hit will deal damage to your opponent, stagger them, apply Rend, and apply Disease to them, so a massive debuff on the first hit. And then the follow-up attack will deal a lot of damage in an AoE around you afterwards. In the footage here, it looks like there is some pretty decent tracking on this ability, as you can see the character sticks right to the mob when he uses the Skyward Slash initially, and the stagger buys you enough time to land that next attack successfully, it looks like, as well. So it's going to be a powerful 2-hit move that will debuff your opponent pretty heavily, so pretty good for PvP, I think, but it does have kind of a medium to longer cooldown for an attack like this. Moving over to the Defiance tree, the first ability we have is Steadfast Strike. The first thing I notice about this ability is that it has a pretty decent amount of lunge range. On top of it, returning 20 stamina on each hit is going to be massive for stamina sustain. This right away gives this ability really good utility for PvP. And the first hit is also a stagger, with the second hit being a pull, so lots of control from it as well. The initial strike also heals you and will apply 2 stacks of bleeding if you're in Defiance stance to the opponent, and the second strike will reduce the cooldown of all your other Greatsword abilities by 20%. For me, this ability seems really similar to the Great Axe's Reap skill, and functions as a powerful control/damage attack, but again with about a 20-second cooldown. The next skill we have is Calamity Counter, and this is basically the Greatsword's riposte. I think it's going to be a very good skill in PvP, but it functions a little bit differently. So, when you use the skill, you're going to block for 2 seconds with 90% reduced block cost, and then you unleash a counter strike that hits all foes within a 4-meter radius. Depending on how many attacks you blocked, the attack will either just deal 100% weapon damage, all the way up to staggering and then knocking back your foe. This ability will also have Grit when you use it, which is really nice. and you can activate the counter earlier with a light attack if you want to as well. The counter attack will also apply stacking bleeds to your target depending on how many attacks you blocked, and has a greatly increased crit chance, increasing even more if you're in onslaught stance, or it will heal you if you're in defiance stance. I think this is a very strong counter ability. However, it does come at the cost of you actually having to use stamina in order to use it. So it's not going to be the save that Riposte is. However, it will offer a ton of offensive utility that Riposte doesn't. In short, I think this will be a very powerful counter skill for PvP. And finally, the last skill we have is Roaring Rupture. This seems like a large AoE blast that is mostly a defensive utility skill on top of dealing some damage. You gain Fortify while using it, you're going to cleanse off 2 debuffs after using Roaring Rupture, which actually gives it just some pure defensive utility. You don't even need to attack an opponent with it. And then you have the choice between 2 final passives. Intimidating Roar will apply Weaken on target's hit and make you uninterruptible for 5 seconds after hitting an opponent, which is super nice in PvP. And then the Adaptive Rupture choice will give you a 3-meter pushback if you're in Defiance stance, and if you're in Onslaught stance, the wave will instead pull foes 3 meters towards you. I like this ability for the defensive and offensive utility that it provides, but mostly I just like that there's a Purify attached to one of the Greatsword skills that you can use on demand. So let's take a quick look at the Greatsword passive, starting off with the Onslaught tree. First one here, Giant Slayer, 20% increased damage against foes above 90% health. Heavy Blade, charged heavy attacks have 15% armor penetration. This is awesome for PvP. Swift Onslaught gives you 20% haste for 5 seconds after using an Onslaught tree ability. This is a big deal because I don't think that Greatsword has haste outside of this passive, so yeah, 20% haste is a lot too. Keen Posture, after gaining Onslaught stance, your next attack within 5 seconds will be a guaranteed critical hit. Aggressive Shift will enter you into Onslaught stance by hitting an opponent with a charged heavy attack. Critical Comeback, become energized by landing a critical hit and regain 5 stamina and 5% base health for 5 seconds. This seems like a very strong utility passive in PvP. Crush the Weak, critical hit chance is increased by 10% when attacking foes with an active debuff. Step and Strike, after dodging, gain 10% empower for the next 3 hits within 10 seconds. And attacks empowered by this effect will restore 10 stamina on hit. And the final ability, Unrelenting Onslaught, hitting foes reduces Greatsword cooldowns by 2% per light attack and 10% per heavy attack. So the Onslaught tree seems very offensive, focusing on stamina sustain, outgoing damage, and even giving access to some haste and some healing power. This makes me think that Greatsword could be a very stamina-efficient weapon if played properly. And the Stam Sustain makes a lot of sense because being in both Onslaught and Defiance stance will be pretty stamina-intensive if you're using heavy attacks. Moving over to the Defiance tree, the first passive we have is Cleansing Chain. Hitting the final attack of a Greatsword chain reduces the duration of debuffs on you by 10% on a 5-second cooldown. Perfect Vigilance, if you are hit while at full health, reduce the damage taken by 20%, then gain 20% Fortify for 3 seconds on a 20-second cooldown. Very powerful defensive passive here, but a rather long cooldown to it. Wary Posture, after gaining Defiant Stance, the next damage taken within 5 seconds is reduced by an additional 25%. Blade Honing, base damage is increased by 3% for each Greatsword buff on you at a max of 4 buffs. Unflinching Blade, charged heavy attacks have grit and inflict bleed for 6 seconds as well. Guarded Shift, blocking for 2 seconds causes you to enter Defiant Stance. Arrow Deflection enables blocking of ranged attacks with a Greatsword, but increases stamina damage from blocking any attack by 10%. This is huge because Sword and Shield is the only other weapon set in the game that can block ranged attacks, so Greatsword is being added to that list. Faultless Defender, reduce stamina damage by 50% when blocking attacks just after you've raised your guard or with guard point, and inflicts a 5% rend for 10 seconds against melee attackers. And finally, Undying Defiance, heal for 5% of damage from all attacks, and attacks within 3 seconds of blocking heals for 15% of the damage dealt instead. So again, the Defiant tree seems pretty focused on durability and healing power, as well as giving some more stamina sustain and access to more bleeds. This is pretty interesting because I see a lot of different bleeds across the Greatsword. So I would say that Defiance feels like more so the defensive tree, but I think a good mixture of two will give you the best offensive or defensive build that you're going for. Especially in PvP, the Stam Sustain from the Onslaught tree will be very valuable. So there you go, all the Greatsword skills and passives. My initial thoughts on this weapon is good. I think it's going to be strong in PvP. I see a ton of abilities that have a ton of utility in PvP. On top of it, the stamina sustain that Greatsword has is going to be a massive deal in PvP as well. I also think this weapon has a good mix of everything in its skill trees. You're going to be able to build the Greatsword to the playstyle that you want, and I think it will pair pretty well with a lot of the weapon options that you have for it. Of course, I would love to hear what you guys think about this weapon and what you guys are predicting buildcraft-wise in the future for it. You know me, I'm definitely going to be pairing it with Rapier to give this weapon a try initially, but I'm excited to try a few different combinations with it and see how it turns out. Of course, if you want to see a bit of a written guide to the Greatsword, you can find a link down below on my website, pvpnewworld.com. I've got links to all of my builds on there and other information on the game if you're interested. You can give me a follow on Twitter if you guys want to keep up to date with me. Give me a follow on Twitch if you want to catch some live streams. And of course, we feature the New World Top 5 battles, so if you have an awesome fight or even a build that you want to see featured on the channel, you can send that to Christopher@pvpnewworld.com. This show is sponsored by What the Fast, a VPN for gamers that can give you better ping to your favorite games, free to try for the first month. There's a link down below for you guys. And last but not least, a massive thank you to all of my patrons on Patreon for supporting the show. Thank you everybody, as always, just for tuning in and watching. And I hope you're excited for this new weapon. I know that I am. Can't wait to get on the PTR and test it. And of course, have a great night, everybody, and I'll see you next time.